Hello, and welcome to Principles of Microeconomics. This is Module 2.3, and here we will introduce the concepts of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. In economics, the idea of welfare economics looks at the efficient allocation of resources between different economic agents in our models. When we're going to look at consumer surplus, we will be looking at the benefits for buyers of paying less than their maximum willingness to buy. For producer surplus, we will be looking at the benefit for firms for receiving a price higher than their cost of production. What we argue in economics is that the equilibrium outcome in the supply and demand model yields the highest level of consumer surplus and the highest level of producer surplus, and therefore yields the most efficient allocation of resources. It is the optimal outcome in our model. So let's start first with consumer surplus. Whenever you go into the store, either consciously or subconsciously, you have a maximum price that you are willing to pay for a good or service. That is true for all consumers. Of course, you can imagine how happy you would be if you had to pay less than your maximum price. That level of satisfaction is what we call consumer surplus. You're happy that you are paying less than your maximum amount. So, what we assume is that at lower prices, a consumer is better off because he's not paying his full maximum price. So therefore, we can calculate consumer surplus as the difference between the willingness to pay and the actual price paid. On our supply and demand graph, the consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand curve or above the price. So let's look at an example here. Let's consider a situation where you are thinking about paying for a bottle of water at a summer concert. Summer concert, probably pretty hot, maybe you've been there all day and you're quite thirsty. How much would you pay for that bottle of water? So keep that in mind. If the price of water is actually $2.50 per bottle, would you buy the water? Well, if your maximum price is $5, then yes, you would pay. And you would benefit, and your consumer surplus would be $2.50. The difference between the actual price and your maximum price. So that your consumer surplus would be $2.50. Now, if your maximum price was only $2 and the actual price is $2.50, you wouldn't buy the bottle of water. So therefore, as you can see, the consumer surplus is going to be the area below our demand curve and above the price. Now, what if the price of a good changes? Let's assume that the price falls to $1.50. If your maximum price is $5 that you're willing to pay, well, now your consumer surplus has risen because you pay even less for that bottle of water. So now your consumer surplus will be $3.50. What if the maximum price you were willing to pay was $2? Well, now the actual price is below your maximum price, so now you're purchasing the bottle of water, and you have positive consumer surplus. For this consumer, their consumer surplus will be $2 minus $1.50, the actual price, so that we have a consumer surplus of 50 cents. Okay? So now we can see as there's a fall in the price of the good, we have an even greater amount of consumer surplus. It'll be this entire triangle that we had before, plus this new area below the demand and above the new price. This new consumer surplus is going to include the gain in consumer surplus from the people that were already in the market, the people with the maximum price of $5, plus the gain in consumer surplus for our new consumers in the market. Now, what about producer surplus? Well, for each of our producers and every firm, at a minimum, they are hoping to cover their costs. So producer surplus is going to be the area below the price and above the supply. This is going to represent the difference between the price that the firm actually receives and the price that they are willing to accept to cover their costs. The larger the area of producer surplus, the better off the firm is going to be. So now let's look at an example where we have independent food and beverage vendors, and they are also looking at the willingness to sell of a bottle of water. For vendor A, his willingness to sell is going to be $3. For vendor B, his willingness to sell is $2.75. For vendor C, it'll be $2. So these are the minimum prices that they are willing to accept so that they can cover their costs of operating at this summer concert. So if we look at the area of producer surplus, if the price of the bottle of water is $2.25, who is actually going to sell water? The only vendor is going to be vendor C, and his producer surplus is going to be 25 cents. The difference between the actual price, $2.25, and his minimum price of $2. So the area of producer surplus, therefore, is going to be the area below the actual price, $2.25, and above the supply curve. Now, what if the price of the bottle of water rises to $3.50? Well, in that case, all of the vendors will want to sell water because their minimum price they are willing to accept is going to be below the actual price of $3.50. So that the producer surplus for vendor A is 50 cents, for vendor B it's 75 cents, and for vendor C it'll be $1.50. So we have the area of producer surplus that we had before coming from vendor C, but now we also have the additional producer surplus that vendor C gains from this higher price, which will be this area right here. Okay. He goes from a producer surplus of 25 cents to a producer surplus of $1.50. That's quite a big gain for him. And now we can also include the new producer surplus for vendors A and B because they previously were not in the market selling water, and now they are. So you can see here that the producer surplus is the gain for firms from receiving a price higher than their minimum that they're willing to accept. And it is going to be characterized as the area below the price and above the supply curve. So when we look at total economic surplus, this is going to be the combination of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. This is going to be captured as the value to buyers minus the cost to sellers. Now, why is that? Well, when we look at consumer surplus, this is the willingness to buy minus the actual price plus the producer surplus, which is the actual price minus the willingness to sell, which is really based on our cost. So if we equate this, we can get rid of the actual prices on both sides so that our total surplus is the willingness to buy minus the willingness to sell, which is also the cost to sellers. So what we argue is that when we have the equilibrium outcome in the supply and demand model, and we can get to a point where we reach the market clearing price, then we can say that the goods are allocated to the buyers that value them the most and to the sellers that can produce them at the lowest cost. So therefore, at the point of equilibrium, if we label that E, we are maximizing consumer surplus, and we are maximizing the area of producer surplus. So therefore, we argue that once we reach the free market outcomes and reach our equilibrium point, we have the most efficient allocation of resources, the maximum level of consumer surplus, the maximum level of producer surplus, and this is the optimal outcome for all economic agents interacting in this market. Thank you so much for joining me in Module 2.3 on consumer and producer surplus.